Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's event, the DZone Microservices and Containerization Trend Report Virtual Roundtable, sponsored by Camunda and vFunction. Before we get started with today's event, I have a few housekeeping items that I need to go over. First, if you have any questions for our presenters today, the Q&A panel is located under the chat bubble. You can post in there, and we will get to it after the presentation if time allows. Second, if you experience any technical difficulties, you'll also find a direct message function. You can send a direct message to me, and I'll work with you to resolve any technical issues. Last on my housekeeping list, today's presentation is being recorded, and it will be available shortly after the event ends. Now that we're through with the housekeeping items, I'd like to introduce you to our presenters. I'll tell you their name, title, and company, and they'll tell you a little bit about themselves. So we're going to start with Guillaume Hugo, Director of Engineering at DZone. Guillaume, welcome. Tell us a little about yourself.
Hi, everybody. So my name is Guillaume. I'm working at DZone as a Director of Engineering with Rich. I have now like 15, 16 years experience in technology. So I saw the topic of today, microservices and containerization appearing, growing over time, being adopted by many companies, including DZone. So happy to have you for today and to share the discussion.
And Guillaume contributed the introduction to our trend report, so thank you for that. We also have with us today another contributor to the report, Boris Zakin, software and cloud architect at NordCloud, and he contributed the multi-cloud strategies using microservices architecture section of the report. Boris, tell us a little about yourself, please.
Hey all, hey everybody, Boris Zakin here. So my name is Boris Zakin, and I'm senior software architect at NordCloud and IBM company. So my primarily focus is the building the complex solution and architecture based on microservices on different cloud, Azure, Google Cloud, and AWS. So also my focus on the building the everything on the Kubernetes part, on the event-driven architecture and other technologies.
Great. Thank you, Boris. Thank you for joining us today. Also on our panel today, we have Bob Quillen, Developer Ecosystem Lead at vFunction. Bob, tell us a little bit about Bob.
Thanks. Yeah, Bob Quillen. I'm a Dev Ecosystem Lead at vFunction, and been to vFunction several years now. We help companies transform complex monolith applications into microservices. So this is right up our alley and our customers' alley in terms of providing an AI-driven solution for that. My background is on the developer side and the evangelism side. I co-founded Stack Engine, which was a container management product company back in 2016. It was acquired by Oracle Cloud, and we were one of the early container management systems. We actually led the development of a lot of the Kubernetes, serverless, and container management products in the Oracle Cloud. So now at vFunction and focusing on helping people move their monoliths into microservices using automation and AI.
Great. Thank you, Bob. Also with us today, Nuwan Diaz, Deputy CTO, WSO2. And among other things, he contributed the approaches to cloud native application security portion of our trend report. Nuwan, please introduce yourself.
Hey guys, and thanks Rich for having me. My name is Nuwan Diaz. I work as Deputy CTO for WSO2. So right at this point in time, I'm working on building a product which makes cloud native application development. It's called Choreo, and my history, I've been working on API management products and integration products, for about 10 years now. Yeah, that's me.
Great, welcome. Also today we have Jeff Carpenter, software engineer, DataStax, and he contributed the Simplify Your Microservices Architecture with a Data API portion of our trend report, among other things. Jeff, tell us about yourself.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I started working with what was called service-oriented architecture when I got to start working on an R&D project at Motorola back in, I don't want to say it, but 1999. So I've been following this trend, the evolution from SOA through the days of SOAP through our more modern approach in microservices in the cloud. Yeah, and most recently I've been working to abstract database access through this concept of a data API gateway, which is what I wrote about in the report. So thanks for having me on.
Great. I won't point out that there might be some of our attendees today that were just wee babies back in 1999. That probably won't help. And last but not least, we have Thomas Heinrich, developer advocate from Camunda. And Thomas, welcome.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me, Rich. So yeah, quick words about Camunda itself. So our company is focusing on building tooling around microservice orchestration. And in my role, or before, in regards to my background, before I've actually joined this company, I was working at Siemens, where we moved or transitioned a very old legacy system to a microservice architecture, which was kind of fun since most of the components were older than I am. And yeah, at Camunda, I joined various companies on their way to get a hold of their microservice chaos, or move to microservice architecture and apply orchestration. So this was kind of fun. Yeah, that's it.
Great. Well, thank you all for joining us today. We're all very excited about this. We have a lot of enthusiastic chatter about this on LinkedIn already, and I think we have some people who are really excited about the trend report. So hopefully everyone in attendance got to read the trend report. I know you all have, and you all contributed to it. So we're excited to talk about our findings. What we're going to do today is I'll throw out some talking points, some questions, some interesting findings from the report, and then you all can talk about it. I'll throw it to one person, and then you can comment, question each other. You can disagree. Let's do it politely, of course, I'm sure, and I think we'll dig in really well. So our first thing that we noticed, based on our research, 93% of our respondents, our developer respondents, work for an organization that runs microservices. That number's up from 74% just a year ago in our 2021 report. We asked the same question. So the two parts: what do you think has attributed to this growth of the adoption of microservices, and what recommendations do you have for the remaining 7% of those companies that don't run them? So is there someone who would love to start with this?
I can start.
Great.
So, in general, our company also adopt this, so to say, architectural approach for the developing a new application. However, there is a lot of challenges regarding this approach. So, for example, when a new company or the enterprise level company comes, or customer, they always say that we have a huge monolith, and then we need to separate it to microservices because it's a trend now. So we need to do this. And usually we are starting to maybe 60% company to 60% of companies. It's almost impossible to do because it's they have written everything in a monolith. So it's a legacy code. So it's usually not the case for them. So, but still they insist on doing this. So. What do you think, guys?
Yeah, I will quickly unmute myself here. So from my experience, when building kind of those monolithic applications for a certain period of time, this goes well. But at a certain point, the overhead in maintainability, kind of also dependency management in monolithic application gets so big that even adding more little features breaks often things, takes way too long, and is a huge inefficiency. And therefore, I can understand that they want to move into the microservice trend. And I do see the biggest challenge there is to manage to do this kind of step by step, and not like with a big disruptive kind of project, and rather have it sustainable. So rather add new features as microservices, change the framework underneath, so on and so forth. So yeah, I do see a reason for these older projects, for those big monolithic systems, but also in the survey that was listed, those 7% of the companies who don't run microservices, sometimes there might be a good reason to it. Yeah, that's my opinion on this.
Yeah, I can echo based upon our research that we've done. We did a recent research report Wakefield Research did it for us, and it was like 80% of application modernization projects fail. So that move to monolith from monolith to microservices is very difficult. But there is a push for it, and you kind of asked about what's driving it, and we're seeing this shift from people just doing migrations and lift and shift into modernization. So there's that push up into the belief that microservices are going to drive, these benefits, and we could talk about those as we go forward probably in this session. But the idea that lift and shift is beginning to fade away, and more modernization is being pushed forward. But the challenges with that is, having the right data-driven plan, the right, organizational structure, and a variety of other things that contribute to the success. And I think we'll drive into a lot of that as we go into this. But we're seeing that same kind of tension and issue about how do you make these migrations more successful, and then also in how do you move them into a modernization phase where they're getting the benefits of microservices. So it's the shift is there, but there's challenges along the way for sure.
Yeah. To it, I guess the benefits are the usual suspects. You get incremental delivery, you get more robust software, of course, if you do it all correctly, right? And if you look at the state of the world is very dynamic. There's a lot of demand for being able to change rapidly, right? And act fast. Architecture obviously helps you to deliver incremental changes, especially if you're in a SaaS-like world. It helps you to deliver incremental. Yeah, and as for the
I think we had a little bit of a freeze there, but I think that transitions well to our next topic. And Nuwan, if you unfreeze, we'd love to hear more what you were saying. 71% of our respondents noticed that adopting microservice architecture resulted in higher feature velocity, and some of you started to touch on some of the benefits. I'd love to hear about some of the benefits you've experienced in your adoption of microservices. Jeff, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the benefits that you see?
Yeah, for sure. I do really see it as being the case of the early stages of microservice adoption looked a lot more like we're going to put a few services around the edges of our monolith and sort of abstract access to it. And my observation and that of others was those teams quickly began to run circles in terms of iteration, their ability to iterate quickly in feature velocity as compared with the teams that were back maintaining the monolith, which had much different release cycles. And so there led to be kind of an impedance mismatch, and like this led to an increasing urgency of, man, we've really got to start breaking up this monolith because we have teams working at two totally different tempos.
Yeah, I think
Rich, we can't hear you.
I muted myself so that I could hear everyone talk. Thank you for that. Appreciate that. What I was trying to say was Nuwan jumped back in after maybe a little bit of a freeze. Did you want to touch on anything you were saying earlier? I know you got cut off by the freeze there.
Yeah, sorry, my connection dropped off for a second. Yeah, I was just trying to finish it off by saying, like, for those people who don't, right, I can quote a recent example where there was a company which went on into a microservices architecture like crazy, but later they realized that certain part of it, although they do microservices, they never release components by themselves. They always release like a bunch of components together. So in a way, it really didn't suit them. Like there was no point in going to a microservice architecture at the end of the day, but because you never release them today independently, you always release them together. So they went back into a monolith architecture because that served them better to deliver fast results. So yeah, there are sometimes good reasons to not do microservices as well.
And I'd love to touch more on that in a minute. So thank you for expanding on that idea, and we'll come back to some of the reasons why a company would not adopt microservices in a minute. But Jeff, you spoke eloquently about some of the benefits. Anyone want to jump in and comment on what Jeff said, add to it, talk more about some of the benefits that we haven't touched on yet?
So one thing about the companies who adopt or not adopt the microservices, I think everybody covered that. It's obvious. that a lot of people are switching from monolith to microservices is not like just a trend. This is like general, like almost 100% of project people are switching from the old style monolith to microservices. And what we can see, if people who the 7% who haven't adopted microservices means 7% who haven't adopted microservices. Because if you look at the trend, in few years you will have like 7, 5, 3, 0%. The only two reasons you still have those 7%, this is because they are in progress. So I think Bob talked about that, the complexity of migrating like a big monolith project to microservices. It can be hugely complex for all projects. Is the exact reason why for new project people adopt the microservices architecture, to make sure they don't reproduce this error that makes migration almost impossible without like restarting from scratch. Or the other reason could be your company is too simple, because microservices is supposed to address the problem you have when you can't scale anymore, when you reach a limit, because monolith becomes too complex to understand all the small evolution you have to do in every part of your software. In that case, you need microservices. If you know you will stay simple, if you don't need microservices, of course, we stay with the monolith just because it's quicker, simpler to implement only one stack. But if you look overall on the technology of today, everything is interconnected. I don't know any system that doesn't run with any third-party services. All third-party services runs using services, as the name says. So the obvious reason is for yourself to start building something compatible with that. And of course, you want to think about the future, so you know you will want to scale at some point, and will become you have to be connected to a more complex world of today. So that's why I think it's not just a trend; it will be like in a few years, 100%.
Yeah, I also agree with Jerome and Jeff, and also can add that there is one issue with microservices, and I think everyone's understand this pattern on their own way. So some people think that they have their own architecture, for example, monolith or event-driven, and they say, we start splitting our functionality on some pieces, and we name it as a microservices. But what exactly a microservices for you? What does this mean? So it has a lot of talks about it, but everyone's understand it in different ways. So maybe we can define how you guys understand the microservices.
Yeah, I think that's a really good comment. And for me, microservices, or when talking about them, I always envision like these self-contained systems. And I'm quite a big fan of these. So having like UI, business logic, and also data tied into one service, and have them then separated over, for instance, a journey of multiple of these kind of tasks, and then having
exactly
them,
yeah. I think we when we do our decomposition of vFunctions, always trying to look at domains and try to get those domain-driven design, and trying to automate that as much as possible, and try to get one domain so you can actually have that functioning independently. It's much easier said than done. But as you eliminate dependencies and focus on those domains, that domain-driven design actually drives the ability to do strangle patterns and other things that are best practices around that. And that, basically gets back to the benefits of being, reducing your technical debt and then increasing innovation. Those are two things we see a lot of. Helping people measure the technical debt they're carrying and giving that as a business case and the data around that. Then that in turn increases your innovation to create more things and do things better and faster. So it depends on, one's a technical term, but one's a business term. Innovation is a good way to justify a business case around modernization, because it actually is something that the execs might actually respond to more so than reducing tactical debt, which we all know is sitting out there. So that's another area where I think we're seeing a lot of interest is, the monoliths carry all this debt. How do I reduce it so I can actually apply those capabilities, those hours, that total cost of ownership into higher level features within the business. So.
There's a really interesting question that I think Boris raises about, what is, how do I know what a microservice is in my context? How do I define it? I've been party to, I'll admit, a number of arguments about the granularity of microservices, how big is too big, or how small is too small. When do I know if I need to go even as something as small as like a function or a function as a service type platform, I think it's really hard to come up with hard and fast rules that apply in every situation to how to do that. But something I'd be interested in learning more about, actually.
Yeah, actually, I agree with you guys. So it's true. It's sometimes really hard. So, for example, some people think that it's even microservices is a separate application that bounded in one bounded context or several contexts if we're gonna talk about domain-driven design, and even separate teams can work on each of microservice or application independently. So maybe you have some experience in this topic.
We've had customers work on mini services, they call them sometimes, where you don't have a database that stays as a monolith, but they start breaking them into mini services and helps reduce the fight over is it a microservice or not. So or they just call it a service. But in the end of the day, decomposing the monolith in any way you can is a good thing, no matter what you call it.
So it sounds like understanding the concept and how you define it and how it relates in your individual context is one thing that might be preventing this 7% from adopting. But as Guillaume talked about, it's going to be trending toward 0%, toward 100% of adoption. But can you think of any challenges that these companies that haven't implemented microservices yet might face as they try to approach it?
Yeah, I'm happy to go first here. So what we usually see is a company who has gone fully on microservices from 10 to 50 to 100 microservices for one kind of journey. For instance, customer onboarding, order management processes for all these kind of things. And then they suddenly notice, hey, I want to add a new functionality because the domain has changed, or there's simply a new thing in the flow which needs to be added there. And then they release, hey, how are they actually communicating? Through events should be nicely decoupled, but I have no clue where to actually add something in order to make it work, and which services need to then adapt and change. So this is kind of the biggest challenge, I would say, I do see, especially with our customers. Since we do orchestration, they usually come to us with this exact problem. But yeah, otherwise, not sure what the other people have seen.
Yeah, that's true. So that's really the case in our customers. Also, they faced with this issue when they have like a 50, 100 microservices, or how they call this microservices, even supported by several teams. And when some customers decided to move back from microservice to the monolith. So it's a case because it's extremely huge effort to deploy, to provide this proper CI/CD, especially choose this one or several cloud providers. So it's better for them just to move to the more reliable or simpler architecture, because basically they will not win. So they from monolith to microservices, they have the same performance, but way more issues like organizational and others. So it's a big challenge.
Yeah, I'd echo the organizational challenges. We've seen people move to an architecture more microservice oriented, but try to keep a monolithic architecture or organization. So if you're not making your organizational change, building domain-driven teams, different team topologies, you also have to look at how you organize your teams and make that change from a management perspective, a product management perspective, developer perspective too. And if they don't do that, it kind of gravitates back to monoliths again. So it's an org structure that goes along with the dev structure too. So.
I'm going to throw a different angle at you. I'm in what I would count as at least my third time through a multi-year modernization effort. We're going to change the company or we're going to change our industry kind of thing. The first one was kind of a military planning application. The second was a hotel reservation system being built in the cloud, and now I'm working on a database as a service. And the number one common thread through all of that is observability. And there have been great point solutions over the years, like, hey, we have this great log aggregator. Great, Elk Stack. This is going to solve it for us, or Datadog or whatever. And the hardest problem in all of this is really kind of getting those aggregated views. Like, you need to be able to look at things in aggregation, the observability of your system as a whole, and then also at the same time be able to drill down to the logs of a specific service that is failing. And the challenges in putting together an observability platform that can give you the world view and then go down to the most minute level has been the bane of my existence, or the hardest problem in supporting a microservice architecture.
Yeah, I completely agree with the architectural and observability challenges. So yeah, I'd like to throw in a different perspective. Right, in general, what I've seen is operations and security are major challenges. So as Jeff was just talking about, collecting logs is one part of operations. Yeah, right. It's hard. Keeping it up and running is hard. And some would say Kubernetes is the answer, but it's not a silver bullet, right? You need a lot of knowledge and skills in order to run a Kubernetes cluster, and you have all these challenges. And security is also a challenge, because in a monolith, you usually have like 1 or 2 entry points into the application, and you secure it with a firewall, you're mostly done. Microservices, you have 100 entry points into applications and possibly more, right? So I have to secure all of these things and make sure nobody gets in through any of those holes that you now opened up, right? So these are all challenges. I mean, in a way, I guess it's a challenge, but there are big benefits as well. Yeah.
So concluded, it's basically, okay, you need new talent, you need a new organization, you need new software, and of course those observability issues and so on and so forth. So that's worth to keep in mind.
Yeah, the monitoring and the observability always sort of is on the tail end of it, but it does seem like with things like open telemetry and software tracing, and a lot of them are coming together from an open source perspective, but it's very complex, it's componentized. It's different from what you're used to doing, and you can't just roll the old ways out. So I completely agree. I've kind of been on the observability side. And DevOps always seems to follow, the stack tooling always seems to follow the dev architecture. So I think it's getting better, and the standards are getting there, but the best practices are in between. So I'm with you, Jeff, there for sure.
All right. We talked about the challenges, and I want to move into our next topic in a minute, but I did want to note that I forgot to mention that the Q&A panel is open. If you go under the chat bubble, you'll find the Q&A panel. We have one question already submitted, and we'll get to those questions at the end. We'll try to save some time for that, but please feel free to drop any questions there in the Q&A section under that chat bubble. You talked about the challenges, but nonetheless, despite these challenges, there are lots of applications of microservices being built out. And in fact, 81% of our survey respondents noted that they've personally built microservices. So I'd love to hear from you about your personal experiences. What are some microservices use cases that you've built? Anyone want to take that away?
Yeah, so I can start this topic. So my example, it's actually based on the IoT domain. I don't know why it's the best domain where you can build microservices, maybe from my perspective, but my case was like the company. Unfortunately, I can say the name, but it was about a smart home, and it was like an enterprise level company that contained all, I would say, providers that build the devices for smart home in one huge application and platform, and they really were successful with this, let's say, management of the smart home. So it was my experience. Maybe you have a different one.
So whoever wanted to speak up, otherwise. So my experiences, I already sliced along it, are these kind of typical processes a company has, like customer onboarding, some service delivery, or those typical order management systems, provisioning, where you have like multiple systems involved usually, and which have been in the past been covered by big monolithic applications, and now there's the need for those smaller solutions, and it is going quite well. Yeah.
We've seen a cluster of financial services, loan processing, like big old Java enterprise apps. These are built on WebLogic or Old Spring or WebSphere, infrastructures. Things in the automotive industry, for sure, we're seeing a bunch of that happen. Reservation system and airlines. These are classic back office apps, 20, 30 years old, core to the business itself, but also very risky to change. And I think that's one thing as you see this next wave, you're seeing a lot more those risks. They're doing it maybe one service at a time. They're doing very sequentially, very iteratively. But as you get these big applications, the reason they want to modernize them is because they run the business on them still. But they're also business critical. So it's a very, it's been higher risk because there's been a lot of failure. So having the right tools in place and best practices is going to help move this forward as the numbers are showing in this survey. So.
Yeah. So we are building a SaaS basically on a microservices architecture, and it's rolling out well for us. So yeah, I mean, we had to make some organizational changes. Like we didn't have an SRE team before. We had to spawn up a separate SRE team to support this. And one of the other decisions I think that worked out well for us is we kind of came up with a mantra saying if something is available as a service, and if it's not something that would differentiate you from your competitors, go and use it instead of building it on by yourself. History, we were an open source company, so we used to use open source libraries a lot. Now we've kind of changed the mantra to say if something is available as a service and it fits you strategically, go use it. So that has worked out well for us as well in this journey.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point that Nuwan brings up. Is we don't have to think about this, but what about the infrastructure that you're using? Is that actually built on microservices under the hood? A lot of times it is. So my favorite project I referenced before is the one I'm working on right now, which is a database as a service, which we've actually taken Apache Cassandra and refactored it as microservices. And then the specific team that I'm on is building an API layer called Stargate on top of that. And the premise is, given a database schema that already exists in your database, what if you didn't have to write a service that wrapped that? What if you could just literally, given a schema, make a REST call or a GraphQL call or a gRPC call and get at that data? So it's a cool concept in the world of infrastructure.
All right, great conversation. Let's move on to one of my favorite questions that we've got here today. Most of you are probably familiar with Conway's Law, but let me just recap it for those who might need a refresher. Any organization that designs a system, defined broadly, will produce a design whose structure is a copy of the organization's communication structure. So I'd love to hear if you agree or disagree with that and why you feel that way. Thomas, I know you had some thoughts on this. Do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, for sure. And we have targeted this topic already previously again. And I think most of us can actually agree that Conway's Law does exist and also agree to this hypothesis. Because if you doesn't change your organization, moving from monolithic architecture to microservice architecture, you won't be successful on a long term. There will always be these kind of drawbacks you will experience, and only by adapting and changing the org structure, those advantages microservice bring can be fully embraced. I'm also talking about velocity, so on and so forth in these regards.
Yeah, I agree with you. So as a result, you even need to change your mindset and the team setup or teams setup and separate your team to the several teams. So I agree with you. So
I think I agree with Conway's Law in principle. I also agree with kind of the inverse or the reverse of Conway's Law. I have seen things move in another direction where over time this tends to happen, where a different team might become more invested in a particular microservice that they depend on and actually begin to start taking over some responsibility. And then you have this question of, do we reorganize, refactor the organization to match the reality of the software that exists today? So anyway, I've seen it sort of work in both directions, which I think is interesting.
Yeah, I think the tail can wag the dog and vice versa. I think sometimes monolithic application teams, are there because it's a monolithic application itself. There's only one way to do it, and everyone's in the same room. Virtual teams, and now that we virtualize a lot in remote office, I think now leads to a lot of opportunities for domain-based teams and different topologies along these lines too. So I do think the world is trending in a way that allows us to break things up in smaller pieces and work in smaller teams, and that actually is conducive to kind of the remote office. So we saw that in one of our other surveys we've done. The required org changes weren't made was one of the top inhibitors to success in app modernization. So you got to have that org structure change, management support. You got to have the right business case and all those kind of things in place. A lot of it is structural, not technical, and so I think they go hand in hand, and it's part of why we're evolving.
Great. Well, I have another statement I'd like to toss out to see whether you agree or disagree with it, and talk a little bit about why. Do you believe that microservices make performance engineering, tuning, and monitoring more difficult? Any thoughts on that? Agree, disagree, and why would you feel that way?
Okay,
yes,
I'm
but
going
it's
to start.
worth it. Please go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely agree with this because it's microservice. Definitely, it's a lot of effort in this round, and moreover, sometimes you have to involve even a separate company to help you with consulting and building this solution. And of course, for observability, it's completely a different domain for you. So you need to choose from the thousands of, as it was mentioned, providers like a Datadog and some log stash and so on. So I agree with this.
Jeff, you said you agree.
I think I agree to the more. Sorry, I was just going to say, I think I agree to the most part, but there are sometimes when having a distributed architecture helps you when it comes to performance, because when you want to scale an application, it's much easier that it is distributed and works in isolation. Now compared to a monolith, right? It's not really easy to scale out a monolith, right? So there are it's pretty hard because you have to deal with a lot of state, and horizontal scaling doesn't always work. But in a microservices architecture, the advantage is there are cases where when you want to increase the performance of a certain part of the application, in most cases you can do re-engineering or fixing a small part of the product instead of re-engineering a major part of the product. So I see that part as a benefit when it comes to performance engineering, but monitoring is definitely a challenge. There's continuous improvements on the tools and technologies that's happening every day. So that's the good news on that part.
I agree with you there. I still remember the times where we had this monolithic application featuring 6 million lines of code, and it was not very performant. Finding where the issues have been were not, this was easy. Like, you had a profiler, you could see where are the problems, but fixing it was so damn difficult. And it was an ongoing thing. Like, making this application Windows 10 ready took us 3 years to really have x64 compile stuff, and it was back in .NET, so it was a lot. And in that sense, it might be that microservices are sometimes also easier to handle.
And how many time it took for you to migrate this application to microservices?
Even longer. I left throughout the halfway, so we started more or less adding some services or new features being then added as a service. we refactored kind of a plug-in framework underneath, so we had multiple components which could be plugged in more easier, and there were no very tight dependencies. But it took long. It took long to get to this stage.
And how you test if they're it really microservices? So you try to turn on and turn off some microservices to see if it's the whole application works independently. So it's interesting to hear your experience.
Yeah. So it was not that easy. As said, there were issues with it. It took until we get to the point where we can actually test something like this, or we had test over the whole services. As said, there was a huge chunk which was, and I think this was previously mentioned, which was just packaged in a container in the end, and there's new which were existing besides of it, but still, for instance, the data model was shared and so on and so forth. There were even more dependencies, and for sure it's still an ongoing project.
Yeah.
So we have in our DZone audience here on the call and elsewhere reading our content and our trend reports, we have developers that are across their journey through their career. Some veterans, some inexperienced, and maybe new to these concepts. So what advice do any of you have for developers who are new to microservices and containers?
So I think you should start with containers from day one. I've worked on architectures where we were running multiple JVMs on a single virtual machine and trying to figure out how to get them to play nicely together. And we've started using we're mostly Java-based services. We've started using Quarkus recently, and the Quarkus build will build you a container for your microservice and deploy it and run it for you. Frameworks like this are awesome and just eliminate a lot of that figuring out how to get a service and then deploy it in a container, and don't even worry about that stuff.
We're seeing a lot of the refactoring projects like that, where people are able to take their Java code and move it forward and use it as a bridge from where they were to these new architectures, and using things like Quarkus. And for sticking with the re-architecture, refactoring allows you to maintain some understanding of existing code. Maybe you actually are still running the microservice in Java, so it's things you've got a touch point or an anchor point, and helps you go forward in terms of learning the new architecture and these new tools. Then you start going to meetups and conferences and taking advantage of all the LinkedIn learning tools that are out there. So it's the self-education and the training that the companies should support, but having a reference point of being able to move an application into this is a good way to learn, because you know something of how it worked before, and you can also follow how it works in the future.
I guess there's also a bit of a significant difference between development time and production time. So development time might seem a bit easy, but running a microservice application in production is challenging. Like we were talking about observability challenges, operational challenges, and so on. So you have to brace for it, and understand the reality of the world. And I'd say it's really a good challenge to have. It's very interesting. The benefits are really useful, right? You can really reap the benefits if you do it right. There are also challenges, but the good news is there are tools and technologies that are making this process easier day by day. So that's my advice.
Great. We are coming up to the last prepared question I have today. I have one question in the Q&A panel, but I'd like to encourage our attendees, if you have any questions, if you just click on the chat bubble there, you can drop some questions in the Q&A panel. I'm sure our group would be happy to answer those. But let's talk about the future. Where do you see the evolution of microservices and containerization going? I'd love to hear your predictions from your crystal balls. No one wants to be wrong. I think that's what's happening.
So I think it is here to stay. right? It's definitely becoming the modern way of programming, with the cloud taking on and so on. So it's definitely here to stay. So it's not going away. And so we just have to embrace ourselves, and use whatever tools and technologies that make this process easier. So yeah, I think this is definitely the future of cloud programming. And Kubernetes is like becoming the operating system of the modern data center of the cloud. And so yeah, so going into university levels and so on, right? Have to be from programming from day one. The students have to be taught from day one into programming in a cloud native. So yeah, I think all of these will line up very nicely.
Yeah, I agree with you, but my point that all technologies should be used in place where they required. So now it's like popular to use Kubernetes everywhere, or put microservices everywhere when it's even not required. So if you need microservices and Kubernetes, then you need then use it. If not, then keep it simple. And if monolith works for you, then use it. If it's not, of course, you can you will receive a lot of problems on your back, because yeah. And moreover, now Kubernetes it became a little bit like a meme. So it's a it's like a joke. So when people deploy their blogs or small websites to Kubernetes and then asking why it's so difficult to maintain it, or so yeah.
Yeah, from an evolution standpoint, I'd say we would expect the operational side to get better, observability to get better, DevOps to embrace all these different technologies, and you see it showing up in these aggregated views. When there's a vacuum, things are going to fill that as an opportunity to fix that problem. So, and it's a huge problem to solve. And as that becomes the de facto way, or is a de facto way to build a new application now, it's going to also provide the second and third wave of enterprise apps after the old applications moving in. And if they can't be, they're going to be retired or just replaced. So you're going to have to figure out what to do with your legacy apps and move those forward. So I think that's the next evolution, is really getting comfortable with how we move those apps in there, while taking advantage of more of the operational side, security side, and all the things that make enterprise apps safe to run in the business. But I expect all that stuff to get better, which then provides a golden path for the older applications to move into.
Great. As I said, we've got one question from the audience. Again, if anyone wants to drop in a question, don't be shy. You can put it in the Q&A section under the chat panel. But some of you are probably familiar with the 12-factor approach to deciding whether an application should be moved to a microservices model. And we have one of our attendees who's wondering if you feel that model, that 12-factor model, is still relevant. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think it's relevant, but it has missed a few important aspects, such as security, and the use of APIs and so on. So I think the concepts in the 12-factor app are very relevant even for today, but it's not sufficient. There are some new developments that have been happening, and you need to consider those aspects as well, like security and the use of APIs and so on. Yeah.
Yeah, I
All
think
right.
in some ways it kind of won the argument, the 12-factor approach, and to the extent that a lot of the principles that are embedded there, there's a lot of developers that don't even know that they came from the 12-factor app. Like the emphasis on statelessness is just one example of that, right? It's kind of baked into the way that we think about building systems now. So like it almost won and then kind of faded into the background.
Great. All right. Well, I think that's all we've got for questions from the group today. So with that, DZone would like to thank Guillaume, Boris, Jeff, Nuwan, Bob, and Thomas for a tremendous presentation. DZone would also like to thank Camunda and vFunction for providing the audience with this outstanding event. Lastly, thank you to everyone who attended today. We hope you learned something new that will help you in your developer career. Thank you, everyone, and have a good night.
Thank you, guys.